Good morning. Welcome to the Baker Institute Energy Forum. We are a 12-year-old program starting this summer. It's very exciting for us. We look at regional trends and global trends that shape the nature of global energy markets and influence the quantity and security of vital supplies of needed fuel. So we have a broad-ranging program. We're very excited about today's event. This is our second time hosting the BP Statistical Review together with the United States Association for Energy Economics. We have had a very busy year this year at the Energy Forum. I know I have some of my members here, so I just want to sort of throw up a slide and tell you we've been busy publishing on this topic. And as when Mark Finley speaks from BP, you'll see why there's so much to write about in the energy world. I'd like to thank our members of the Baker Institute Energy Forum for supporting this program and for your participation. It's been a great year working with you all in thinking about the challenges facing us as we move forward on the energy problem, or maybe I should start calling it a crisis. I don't know when we get to the point of crisis. A colleague of mine here at Rice, Emil Pena, who was Deputy Secretary of Energy when Bill Richardson was Secretary of Energy under President Clinton, came up with what I thought was a great analogy. If you think about 1973, we had this sudden and dramatic cut of supplies and a dramatic price shock, and it happened almost overnight, or it seemed like it was overnight. Now, Emil describes our current situation. He says we're becoming like boiled frogs. So we got into the pot when the water was cool, and somebody turned up the heat, and we just kept swimming, and our temperature kept rising, and we didn't really realize that we were at danger until we got to the point where we were boiled, and we didn't see it coming. And I think that that's sort of a better analogy today for the kind of energy problem we're having, which is just sort of creeping up on us slowly. I'd like to thank my Energy Forum members who are here today. The summer is a great time to thank you for the special support we use for the funding to bring in young people to come here, spend the summer at Rice, and work with us on these policy questions that you just saw the list of. And here is some of our interns that we'd like to thank. Some of them helped with today's event. We have some young people from local area high schools, so we like to highlight that we are reaching out into the community to build the next generation of young people committed to and understanding the energy challenges we're going to face. So before I introduce Mark, I just thought I'd do a couple of Baker Institute hey wow statistics. Since we're going to be so awed by BP, I thought I'd roll it out slowly. So Ken Metlock, who is our other energy fellow, is here today, and he spent some time looking at the historical relationship between WTI and retail gasoline prices. That's always a controversial topic. Let me give the caveat for this chart that this is based on the long-run historical relationship. So, of course, at any given time, you might have a deviation based on some sudden inventory change or weather patterns or so forth. But people always ask us, well, if it was a $200 oil, what would that mean in retail gasoline prices? So you can see that takes us well over $6.50. So for those of you who are wondering, crystal ball, if we have a bad hurricane season or we have some other calamity hit the market that pushes the prices up to the Goldman Sachs number or whoever it is that's banding about that $200 number, that's what it translates into for retail gasoline. The other thing, which I'm sure Mark will talk about at length, is there was this myth in the United States that no matter how high the price of gasoline were to rise, Americans will continue to drive at the same rate as they have in the past. The statistics are just starting to show that the average percentage miles per vehicle driven has actually started to fall in the last 2 years. We expect to see that trend continue. The other thing is apparently it's very popular even among the International Energy Agency, who just made a presentation out in Istanbul at the International Association for Energy Economics, which is to explain to the public and their colleagues that this is different this time because demand will not fall in response to oil prices. Whenever I say this, people who believe in peak oil get very huffy and they say, oh, she's an economist. Economists always say that. Well, that's true. Economists do always say that. And the reason we always say it is because it's true. And it's true this time. So the statistic I like to tell, which is, I have the April statistic because I don't think the May statistic is in an accurate format yet, which is that when the big thing is, oh, China is immune to price response, right? That's the myth. That is the myth driving the futures market. That is the myth driving everybody who says we're going to $200. So let me just point out that if you took April 2007, April 2008, Chinese naphtha demand, which of course drives their petrochemical industry, is down 2% year on year. Chinese fuel oil demand, which one might expect to be used in heavy industry and possibly some power sector use, is down 2%. And so the idea that somehow China's economy is going to grow, and they are somehow have this magic system that is unlike us, where we are going to shrink, that doesn't make sense to me. And so I try to remind people. Everybody says, well, it's not really analogous to the 1970s, and I told you about the boiling frog. It's not 100% analogous, but price rise is price rise. And so I remind people that whenever we have a giant price move, there's always a story. And this time it's the China story, but people forget, because in the 1970s, it was the Japan story. Japan was going to take over the world economy. MBAs at Harvard were going to study Japanese management practices. The Japanese economy was going to grow, and it didn't matter that the United States was in a recession, because Japan would grow and they would use lots of oil, and therefore oil would never come down. And we all know how that story ended. That story ended, excuse me for saying so, with Japan's economy getting stuck for almost 2 decades after a banking problem with non-performing loans. Well, the Chinese banks have, believe me, more non-performing loans than were ever seen in Japan in the 70s. So, and they had embedded themselves heavily with these fancy derivative mortgage-based securities. So it's unclear to me that whether the China story is really going to pan out as we move forward. I think one of the things holding the China story up is the fact that there was hoarding ahead of the Olympics, either accidentally because people wanted to figure that prices would, subsidized prices would go up over time, so they wanted to profit on that, or purposefully by the Chinese government to make sure there were no fuel shortages ahead of the games. Few other little hey wows. If we were still using a dollar priced in the same relationship to euros that we had in, what's my base year here, Ken, 2003? 2000, we'd be at $78 a barrel. Here's a couple of other frightening charts for you from some other study that we've released in May. Looking at the relationship between world GDP growth and oil demand, which I'm sure Mark is going to talk about. But our point is there is a cycle. I understand the reasons why people say this time it's not a cycle, but I just show you this chart going back to 1970. Here's another one going back to 1860, in case that wasn't convincing for you enough to just look at 3 decades. And this is the coincidence of high oil prices and global financial crises. So I just leave you with that. One last thing. I'm not saying that oil prices are going to collapse like they did in the 80s and stay down forever. I understand the burden of the fact that we are projecting this giant rise to come from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. over the next 2 decades, and there's no indication, at least right now, that that oil is in the pipe. But we did do some scenarios about how much one could take off of oil demand using better and better car technology. And we calculated what it would mean if after 2015, all new vehicles in the United States got 50 miles to the gallon. And that does shave at a normal car turnover, so not even at an accelerated turnover, which we might wind up seeing in the next year or two, depending on prices. That does save something like 6 or 7 million barrels a day. So those are our quick Baker Institute statistics. Now we look for the master to come and present us the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. It has provided a high-quality, objective, and globally consistent data set on world energy markets. I'm sure everybody in the room who is an energy expert can attest to the benefit of BP providing these statistics. We all use them. I gave my interns some assignment for the rest of the week that's going to be based on the BP statistics. So we really appreciate BP maintaining this data set. It is one of the most widely respected and authoritative publications in the field of energy economics. And it's basically used by reference for everybody from people like ourselves and governments and media to everybody on YouTube who wants to make a statement about energy prices. So we're very pleased to have Mark Finley here with us today to present the review. He is the General Manager of Global Energy Markets for BP America in Washington, D.C., responsible for BP's coverage of global energy markets, as well as the statistical review. He previously served as a senior member of BP's economics team in London. He comes with 20 years of private and public sector experience as an energy economist, coming from University of Michigan with his undergraduate and his advanced degrees from Northwestern and George Washington University. Mark, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Amy, for the introduction. And actually, that pretty much covered the energy picture, so I really don't have anything to say beyond the substance that Amy covered already. As Amy mentioned, well, let me back up. First, it's a privilege to have the opportunity to come back here to the Baker Institute. I'd like to thank Amy and the Institute, as well as our friends and colleagues at the local chapter of the U.S. Association for Energy Economics for hosting. It's great to see so many friends and acquaintances here today. The presentation that we'll walk through shortly is based on the data in this year's Statistical Review of World Energy. As Amy noted, for 57 years, BP has published something like this review, and the goal has always been the same, and that is to provide objective, factual, global perspective on energy market developments. What you won't get from us is a forecast. Believe it or not, we don't even forecast oil prices internally. But rather, we hope that by providing a comprehensive review of the data that is as timely as possible, we can develop a picture of how we came to where we are today and the framework for thinking about where markets, or at least what the factors will be that will drive energy markets going into the future. The data in the published review has 11 years worth of data for the 5 major fuels, oil, gas, coal, nuclear, and hydroelectricity. Why 11 years? So that we can show 10 years worth of growth rates. We have a lot more data available at our website, including historical data sets, in most cases going back to the mid-1960s, as well as data on renewable forms of energy, ethanol, wind, solar, geothermal power capacity, as well as for power generation. All of this will be covered in the presentation today. By our count, we have about 55,000 data points in our data set that's available for downloading on our website. The good news is that I won't walk you through each of those individual data points, nor will there be a quiz at the end of this presentation, even though we're on a university campus. But hopefully we can sort through some of that for you. We'll start by with the earth-shaking revelation that energy prices have been high and rising recently. And let me just let that sink in for a minute. We'll put that energy price data into context and examine what's really been driving it. Amy foreshadowed some of the stories already. Then we'll dig deeper into the data by proceeding fuel by fuel. We'll start with the oil market and spend most of our time on that because oil is the biggest fuel worldwide, and it's also the fuel that has seen the most rapid price increases in recent years. And then we'll march through the other fuels as well. The presentation overall should take about 40 minutes, and that should leave us with plenty of time for Q&A as well. So, first chart shows the prices. It's not just the price of crude oil that's been going up in recent years. And this chart shows increases in the yellow lines in the price of crude oil, natural gas, and coal over the last 10 years. And superimposed against that is the annual growth rates for global consumption of each of these fuels. So, for example, global oil consumption last year rose by just over 1%. Coal, the fastest growing of the major fuels that we've tracked for 5 years in a row now, globally grew by about 4.5% last year. Some observations on prices. We all know that prices for all forms of energy have been going up, but did you know that through 2007, the price of crude oil increased for 6 years in a row? We have data in our data set going back to 1861. This is the first time in the history of the oil industry that prices have gone up for 6 years in a row. It's never happened before in the 150-year history of our industry. This chart shows that prices have risen more strongly over 10 years. In fact, 10 years ago today, the price of oil was about $12 a barrel. If we look just over the last 5 years, the price of crude oil has quadrupled. The price of at least internationally traded coal, and we'll come back to that, has tripled. And the price of natural gas has roughly doubled. And note that the fuels that have seen the most rapid price increase in recent years, oil and coal, have also seen consumption growth slow. Again, we'll come back to that. Now, as historians as well as economists, we're tempted to say, well, have we seen this before? And in fact, Amy made reference to the fact that, broadly speaking, we have. This chart shows that, in fact, it's not just energy prices that have increased recently, but commodities more generally. Agricultural commodities, industrial commodities, as well as energy. And moreover, that we have seen synchronized commodity price cycles in the past. And as Amy noted, most recently in the 1970s. And the question is, can we look at these two periods together and compare and contrast and learn something by the comparison? Now this chart shows then and now, the period running up to the first synchronized commodity cycle that we had seen on the previous chart, spanning the late 60s to early 1970s, and where we are today. And what this chart shows is global growth in the world's economy in the orange bars and growth in the world's primary energy consumption in the blue bars. One thing that leaps out at you is that economic growth was strong across both. In fact, what you're looking at on this chart are the two strongest 5-year periods of world economic growth ever recorded. However, you also notice one difference leaps off the page at you. Back then, growth in energy consumption more or less tracked with the world's economy. Now, however, following price increases, and by the way, changes in the economy and energy market structure that are more liberalized and more flexible economies and markets, as prices have gone up, energy consumption growth has slowed significantly, even as the economy has remained strong. Last year, global primary energy consumption grew by 2.4%. That's slightly above average, but not as strong as you would expect, given how strong the world's economy has been. And it's not just a matter of how strong the world's economy has been, but where it's been strong and the form of the economic growth that's really mattered for energy consumption and energy markets. This chart shows on the left-hand panel contributions to growth in the world's economy, broken out by contributions from the OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, basically the club of the rich market economies of North America, Western Europe, and parts of Asia. and the rest of the world. Now, over long time periods, a century and a half since the Industrial Revolution, economic growth has tended to be concentrated in the OECD countries. After all, this is how the rich economies became the rich economies of the world. What's interesting is that, to a degree that we have not seen before in economic history, countries outside of the OECD are becoming significant drivers of global economic growth. In fact, over the last 5 years, countries outside the OECD have contributed 40% of the world's economic growth. And you can see the rapid growth in the share of growth coming from these countries. What's additionally very striking is to look on the right-hand side, which shows contributions to growth in world energy consumption. And here we can see that countries outside the OECD have actually contributed 90% of all of the growth in global energy consumption in the last 5 years. Now, as we can see, it's not just that these economies are growing very rapidly, but that they are undergoing a particularly energy-intensive form of economic growth. Another way to look at that is to look at the ratio between economic growth and energy consumption growth. And that's what we show here. It's actually the other way around, the ratio of energy to GDP growth. Anything less than 1 means that your economy is becoming relatively more efficient in the way it uses energy to produce economic output. Broadly speaking, for the world, this has been the general pattern for as far back as we have data. And I'm sure it's a dynamic you're all well familiar with from your own businesses, the constant pressure to do more with less. And we can see that generally plays out around the world. Other things, however, we can also see on this chart are that the level of energy needed to produce a given rate of economic growth in the industrialized economies is much less than is the case in the emerging economies or the developing economies of the world. In fact, it takes the equivalent of 1.5 barrels of oil to produce $1,000 worth of economic activity in the OECD countries. It takes 3 times that much energy, nearly 4.5 barrels of oil equivalent, to produce the same $1,000 worth of economic output outside the OECD. Now, why would that be the case? Why would these economies tend to be so much more energy intensive? Well, first, the world's heavy industry has progressively been moving from these countries to these over a period of decades. Secondly, as we'll see, these economies outside the OECD tend to be more dependent on what turns out to be cheaper forms of energy, and in particular, coal. But we'll also look for other forms of dislocations, and one thing that will come up, especially in the oil market discussion which follows, is the role of subsidies, and especially subsidies in the outside of the market economies. You can see that as prices have increased, the energy intensity of economic growth has decreased around the world. And even here in the OECD countries, there's basically been no growth in energy consumption for 2 years in a row, even though the economies have been growing at or above average rates. Now, to dig into this dynamic a little bit more deeply, we'll need to move into examining developments fuel by fuel. The first fuel we'll cover is the oil market. It's the market that we're most familiar with. It's the only commodity we consume anywhere in our lives where the price is screamed at us from foot-high letters at every street corner. Oil is the dominant fuel in the world, has a market share of over 35% of total global energy consumption. It's also by far the most internationally traded. 2/3 of the world's oil is traded across an international boundary. As we mentioned, it's the fuel that has seen the most rapid price increases. And for those of you who've suffered through these presentations before, you will have heard us in the past say, well, oil prices are rising, but they're not yet at the all-time inflation-adjusted peaks. We can't say that anymore. With the run-up in prices this year, oil prices are at all-time inflation-adjusted levels. And in fact, even if we correct for the efficiency gains that we mentioned on earlier slides, if you look at the dollars spent to produce a given level of economic output, oil prices today are more or less at all-time record highs as well. So no matter how you slice the data, oil prices are at record levels relative in absolute terms, in inflation-adjusted terms, and relative to their role in the economy. Now, with prices rising so dramatically, and as I mentioned, 6 years in a row, looking like it'll be 7 this year, you would expect to see a demand reaction. And actually the answer is, well, kind of. We do see a bit of a reaction, but it's not as much as we would expect. Globally, oil consumption last year grew by 1 million barrels per day. That's slightly below average, and at a time when the world's economy remains strong. But in the face of these rapid increases in prices, we're left wondering why we're not seeing more of a price impact. And what we'll see is that actually the story when it comes to oil consumption is that there's two stories. The first story is here in the U.S. and other market economies, where oil consumption in the OECD fell last year by 400,000 barrels per day, the biggest decline since 1983. And this is a dynamic you are all well familiar with. This chart shows on the right-hand scale the retail price of gasoline in the U.S., and on the left-hand scale changes in U.S. gasoline consumption. And as the price of gasoline goes up, the growth in gasoline consumption moderates and actually begins to decline. So far this year, U.S. gasoline consumption has been declining, partly as a result of a decline in miles driven, as Amy mentioned. But that's really only part of the story. Outside of the OECD, oil consumption growth last year accelerated and was above average. Now, this chart slices the data two different ways. On the left-hand panel, we break out oil consumption growth last year and compare it with the 10-year average for breaking out importing versus exporting countries. Now, oil exporters last year saw their consumption grow by about 3%. Remember, the global total was about 1%. Strongly above average. In fact, oil exporters accounted for half of all the growth in oil consumption worldwide, even though these countries only account for a level of about 20% of the level of consumption. Now, this part of the chart makes sense to me. I think I can understand it. When oil prices are high, an oil exporting economy does very well. Economic growth is very strong. And again, so this part of very strong domestic consumption growth among oil exporting countries makes sense. The part of this chart that I have trouble explaining, at least on the face of it, is to look at non-OECD oil importers, where consumption grew by 1 million barrels per day. And as you can see, that's almost 50% above the historical average. Now, again, for economies that need to pay somebody else for their oil in the face of rapidly escalating oil prices, how do we explain this acceleration in growth? By the way, the majority of it is not China. Chinese consumption growth last year for oil was actually slightly above average, but only accounts for maybe a bit more than 30% of that total increment. The secret of understanding how consumption growth can accelerate outside the OECD, even among importing countries, is to look at the right-hand side of this chart. The right-hand panel breaks out consumption growth based on whether a country subsidizes consumption or not. And what we can see is that all of the net growth in global oil consumption last year came from countries that subsidize consumers, including a number of importing countries. Now, this year, as oil prices have continued to accelerate, we've seen in a number of countries that these subsidy regimes have become unsustainable. Just in recent weeks, we've seen countries from Egypt, India, Pakistan, Thailand, Malaysia, and just last week, China announce reductions in subsidies. And on the back of that, we are expecting to see oil consumption growth this year slow down. Now, to really understand the market, obviously you have to put supply and demand together. Where supply and demand meet is inventories. And this chart shows the yellow band is the historical range for inventories in the market economies. The red line is what happened to inventories last year. And because we're economists and we can't help ourselves, we superimpose the price on every chart we do. But really, actually, if you want to understand how we got to where we are today in the oil markets, the key is to set the rewind and go back and look at what happened in early 2007 and, in fact, in late 2006 as well. Oil prices from late 2006 through 2007 fell sharply from about $80 a barrel to about $50 a barrel. In response, for the first time in about 2.5 years, OPEC members began cutting production in an orchestrated fashion once again. OPEC members announced 2 rounds of production cuts, in fact, in late 2006 and again in early 2007. The announcement of the cuts succeeded in putting a floor under prices early in the year, and later in the year, as these cuts worked their way through the system, inventories fell sharply and prices rose dramatically, and have continued rising even as OPEC members announced a small increase in late 2007. And in recent weeks, we've seen the Saudi government twice in the last month announce additional increments of production. Now, to highlight the role of these OPEC production cuts in the market, let's take a look at what has been happening with changes in oil production broken out into key groupings. The panel on the left shows that average production changes over the last 5 years. And this is a story we know very well. Declining production here in the market economies of the OECD, it's a mature resource base. Continued growth in production in the former Soviet Union, even as growth rates moderate in Russia. On average, over the last 5 years, OPEC members have generally been increasing production to match growing consumption. And what stands out in stark relief, if we look at 2007 in isolation, is the change in OPEC behavior. Now, if you look at the data in our published book, it says that OPEC cut production by about 350,000 barrels per day last year. That actually masks a much bigger decline. Some OPEC members, Angola and Iraq, were not subject to quotas in 2007. I think Angola technically came into the regime at the very end of the year, but not in a way that would matter for the annual aggregates. There are also crude oil, quotas only apply to crude oil. So other liquids production, for example, liquids associated with the production of natural gas, don't count against quotas, and those volumes are growing as well. If we look at just the crude oil production of the 10 OPEC members who were party to the production cutting agreements, crude oil production among those countries fell last year by 900,000 barrels per day. And in fact, if we look country by country, we can see these dynamics as well. The biggest decline in world oil production last year was in Saudi Arabia. The only places where we saw OPEC production increasing in a significant way were those countries that were outside of the quota arrangements. Now, in some OPEC countries, production cuts were exacerbated by other problems. Civil unrest in Nigeria, years of underinvestment for PDVSA in Venezuela. Although the majority of the crude oil cuts that we record appear to have been voluntary in nature, and in fact, even Venezuela, while production is declining anyway, there were some production shut-ins as a result of OPEC decisions. Elsewhere, we see continuing declines in mature OECD provinces like Mexico and Norway. There are some places around the world, actually just a few though, where we can point to and say prices are having a supply impact. One of them is Canada, where production continues to grow in the oil sands province in particular. The other example, it actually isn't on the chart because the increment wasn't big enough, but U.S. oil production last year increased for the first time since 1991. And what's interesting is where the increase is taking place. It's onshore in the lower 48, the most mature oil province in the world, where increased drilling activity, in face of rising prices, is actually caused onshore lower 48 production to rise for the last 2 years in a row after declining continuously since 1985. Elsewhere, we see production continuing to grow in the former Soviet Union, but even there, some warning lights are starting to flash. This chart shows on the left-hand side percentage growth in Russian production since the beginning of the decade. On the right-hand side, we look at monthly data. On the left-hand side, the growth in Russian oil production in aggregate since the year 2000 has met all of the growth in Chinese and Indian oil consumption combined. However, in recent months, in fact, just this year, beginning in January, we have been seeing the first year-on-year declines in Russian oil production since the turn of the decade. Russia has been a high tax regime. The investment regime has become more difficult, especially for foreign companies. As a result, investment activity has declined, rig rates have declined, and following on that, this year we are now seeing declining oil production for the first time this decade. Other issues that we should cover when we think about the oil market. First, refining. There has been a school of thought in recent years, to which we do not subscribe, that constraints in refining capacity have been driving oil prices higher in recent years. To my way of thinking, if the world were awash in crude oil and the bottleneck were at the refinery gate, it would tend to force oil prices down, not up, which is exactly what happened after the U.S. hurricanes in 2005, by the way. If there were constraints in refining, it would explain why refining margins have been high, and in fact, last year they hit record levels. It would explain wide crude quality differentials, which is definitely true, but it doesn't explain why heavy, sour, relatively poor quality crudes are trading well above $100 a barrel today. At any rate, you don't hear that argument so much anymore anyway, because for 2 years in a row, the growth in global refining capacity has actually outpaced the growth in oil demand. And as you can see, the growth rate last year was double the rate of capacity expansion growth that we had seen elsewhere earlier in the decade. Most of the growth is in Asia and in the Middle East, but really it's a global market. And it needs to be emphasized that refined products, as well as crude oil, are global markets. So, for example, this year, a brand new refinery is being built in India, not primarily to service the Indian market, but rather to produce West Coast spec gasoline for export to the United States. Now, this year, we've seen refining margins weaken, especially for gasoline. As we saw earlier, gasoline consumption is declining in the U.S. Ethanol production, as you all know, has been rising rapidly. So that has tended to squeeze refining margins in the United States. Where refining globally is finding support still is in middle distillates, diesel fuel, as well as heating oil and jet fuel. These middle distillates have been the strongest growing segment of global oil demand for 7 of the last 9 years. And anecdotally, it appears to be the case again so far this year. Some of this is structural. In Europe, a shift from gasoline to diesel. Some of it is a direct result of the very strong economic growth we discussed earlier and the simple need to just move stuff around the world. This year, we are also seeing support because of power shortages in a number of countries around the world, and we'll come back to that theme. But it turns out that if you're in a pinch and you need to generate electricity quickly, the only fuel that's really flexible enough to do that is diesel fuel. And we are seeing that diesel fuel for power generation is actually a significant share of the world's oil demand this year. And that's contributing to supporting margins for the production of middle distillates, even as gasoline margins have declined. The next final topic on the oil market before we wrap up is everyone's favorite these days, speculation. This has been tremendously in the news. We have to acknowledge that our ability to marshal data to analyze this question is constrained. The only data we get is from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the U.S. regulator, on trading activity on the NYMEX. We don't have information on over-the-counter trades, exchanges outside the United States, and it's a fairly blunt instrument in the way the data is categorized. But even with those caveats, I think there are some interesting things to say. In recent years, what you're looking at on this chart, and my apologies if I'm going over stuff that most of you know already, what we're looking at on this chart on the left-hand panel are prices for crude oil, heating oil, and natural gas. And on the center and right panels are different indicators of financial market activity. On the far right, open interest is simply the volume of trading, the number of contracts outstanding. The middle panel, non-commercial net length, the regulators report and the NYMEX reports trading activity based on whether the participants have an underlying commercial interest in the commodity. And that category that does not have a commercial interest, people look at as a proxy for speculative activity. Anything above 0 means that this class of traders are net buyers of the commodity in question, and obviously anything below 0 means that that class of traders are net sellers. So what people have looked at in recent years is to say open interest has tripled in the last 5 years on the NYMEX crude contract. The non-commercial participants have been increasingly aggressive net buyers. Aha, that explains why oil prices have been going up. However, if you look at the data that we've arrayed here across different energy products, it's a much more ambiguous picture. First of all, the net positions of the non-commercial traders for crude oil has basically been flat over the last year, even as oil prices have more than doubled. If we look at heating oil, no change in the volume of trading activity, no appreciable change in the net standing of the non-commercial players, and yet heating oil has actually seen more rapid price increases than crude oil. Then look at natural gas, where the non-commercial players are actually net sellers and in fact increasingly aggressive net sellers. And yet over the last year, natural gas prices have also been trending higher. So again, when we look at this data, I don't get a slam dunk that says, oh, well, obviously financial market activity is driving energy prices higher. In fact, our view is that a large share of the increase, a predominant share of the increase in prices that we've seen in recent years can be explained by tightening fundamentals and by changes in perceptions about future fundamentals. But again, those would be the case, those would exist whether there was a futures market or not. I think it's very clear that futures markets can add momentum to an existing trend. But again, at the end of the day, we tend to have the view that largely these futures markets reflect underlying pressures rather than creating them. And in that sense, we tend to view them as a symptom rather than a cause of what's been happening in oil and other energy markets. Now, to wrap up briefly on the oil section before we continue. The oil prices have seen the most rapid increase of any of the fossil fuels we track because oil is a constrained market, and the constraints come in a variety of dimensions. Supply is constrained partly because OPEC members have elected to cut production to support prices, partly because owners of resources have become more aggressive in controlling access and raising taxes to their resources. Russia is a good example of that. We do see continued declines in mature provinces in the OECD as well. All of this is exacerbated by constraints within our industry, constraints on our ability to ramp up investment quickly and efficiently, which manifests itself in rising cost inflation, mounting project delays, etc. On the consumption side, the constraints manifest themselves in the form of subsidies which shield a good share of the world's consumers from the price signals that are being generated here. And in fact, one way to think about this market at the end of the day is that economics tells us that when a market is supply constrained, prices rise to a level that discourage enough consumers from acting to balance the market. Now, I don't know about you, but 5 years ago, if you'd asked me who can afford high oil prices, my answer would have been the rich countries of the world. It turns out, however, that the developing countries, the less wealthy countries in the world, see that their consumers are generally shielded from these prices. And so the price has to go high enough to scare out the richest consumers. And if you think about it that way, it's not surprising that the price has to go pretty high at the margin to discourage the richest people in the world from consuming, to keep the market in balance. Now, one of the questions is, can we see these same kinds of constraints elsewhere in the other energy sources that we track in the statistical review? Let's turn first to natural gas. Globally, natural gas accounts for about 24% of the primary energy mix. It's in third place after oil and coal. As we mentioned earlier, gas was the only fossil fuel that we track that saw global consumption accelerate last year. And again, gas was also the fuel that had, relatively speaking, the weakest price increases. So this chart shows changes in production and consumption last year. The biggest changes in both production and consumption in the whole world last year were right here in the U.S. Production is another investment and market success story. As gas prices have risen in recent years, investment activity has increased, the rig count has increased, and production on the back of that is growing. In fact, the incremental growth in U.S. production last year was the largest since 1984. Consumption growth also was very strong. In fact, the strongest since 1969. With gas, it's very sensitive to weather, so the first thing you think about is, what was the weather situation? In fact, early 2007 saw an unusually cold winter, and that contributed to the strength of U.S. gas consumption. Also, however, remember gas was priced relatively competitively last year. And so we saw gas actually grow more broadly in the economy. In particular, it grew by 10% in power generation. And we'll see examples of fuel competition coming up shortly. Other interesting things on this chart: the second biggest increment to both consumption and production last year in the whole world was in China for natural gas. Gas consumption grew by 20% last year. What is particularly impressive to me in this is that China shows up as the second biggest increment for consumption in the whole world, even though gas only accounts for 3% of China's energy mix. Another interesting wrinkle, Russian gas production last year declined. Actually, no problems with Russian gas production. The problems were with European gas consumption. I mentioned that it was a cold winter in the US last year. It was a warm winter in Europe. In addition, there were LNG cargoes that were available on an incremental or spot basis at prices that were more competitive than the oil-indexed contracts by which Russia sells gas into Europe. And so early last year, Russian shipments to Europe were very weak. I think the data was that in the first quarter, shipments were down by 25%. Now, we do see other examples of how gas competes, not just with itself, but around the world. One of the channels for that competition is the growing trade in liquefied natural gas. Globally, trade in liquefied natural gas grew by 7% last year. The underlying level is actually pretty small. About 8% of the world's natural gas is traded by LNG. The majority of the gas trade is by pipeline. As we mentioned earlier, pipeline trade actually was flat around the world because of the weakness that we described, for example, in Russia and in Western Europe. But LNG trade continues to grow rapidly. What this chart shows is the gas producers in the world, the LNG producers, and the number of different consuming markets they serve. And on the other panel, the major gas buyers, or LNG buyers, and the number of different suppliers they tap into. LNG trade is increasingly linking what had been previously disconnected regional markets for gas. And one thing that we can note is that this shows the diversity and the color coding leaps off the chart at you. The most diverse LNG suppliers in the world are in the Atlantic Basin. The most diverse buyers of LNG in the world are in the Pacific Basin. Now, last year, Japan, the world's biggest buyer of LNG, experienced an earthquake that caused the world's biggest power plant, a nuclear power plant, to shut down. Imports of LNG surged to keep the lights on. Japanese LNG imports last year grew by more than 8%. And where did Japan go to get that incremental volume? Not from their baseline suppliers in the Asia-Pacific Basin, but in the Middle East and increasingly in the Atlantic Basin as well. By the way, the U.S. was also the beneficiary of a relatively flush LNG market, especially in the first half of last year. Last year, U.S. LNG receipts rose by 1/3. Now, the thing about being part of a global market, though, is that sometimes it's cold in your country and sometimes it's cold in somebody else's country. So this year, Europe had a cold winter. European gas prices spiked relative to U.S. prices, and U.S. LNG receipts have evaporated. Maybe that's not the best way to describe it. U.S. LNG receipts currently are about 2/3 less than they were this time last year. And in fact, the absence of those LNG cargoes has been a contributing factor to the tightening of the U.S. gas market, both in absolute terms and relative to competing supplies. Now, speaking of competition, gas is the fuel where we see most clearly examples of interfuel competition. Gas has to compete for markets in many places where there are liberalized energy markets around the world. We see here two examples. One in the UK, where gas over the last couple of years has competed against coal in power generation. Yes, gas was cheap enough to compete against coal. In the US, competing against residual fuel oil. Now, the way to read this chart is that as you move across the bottom from left to right, gas becomes cheaper relative to the competition. And what we can see is that in both cases, as gas becomes cheaper, people use more of it in power generation. By the way, in the panel on the left, the dynamic also includes a price of carbon as part of the EU's emissions trading scheme. Although for most of last year, that dynamic didn't really come into effect because the emissions targets had been incorrectly allocated and emissions prices were basically zero for much of the year. It was not the binding constraint on the system. What we can see, though, is that last year, in the first half of the year, gas was cheap relative to coal in the UK. Coal consumption fell by more than 20% in power generation, and gas consumption rose by more than 20% in power generation. In the US, it's almost not fair to call it competition. First of all, you can see the range is pretty narrow. What we're looking at is total power generated by both gas and oil combined, and of that, gas's share. And you can see that the whole range is only about 10 percentage points. There's not that much power generated by oil in the U.S. And in fact, as you can see, this line flattens out. There's really not any competition anymore. Last year, gas traded at an all-time record discount to residual fuel oil and to crude oil. Basically, all of the capacity that can be switched has. And there's only a few very small niche applications where oil is still used to generate electricity in the U.S. But over the last 2 years, we have seen that change. And in fact, over the last 2 years, the use of oil in power generation in the U.S. has declined by about 200,000 barrels per day. So again, for gas, we do see market forces at work, but we also see how the relative lack of depth in LNG, the lack of fuel switching capacity, impedes the adjustment of the marketplace. If we turn to coal, I mentioned earlier that coal has for 5 years in a row been the fastest growing fuel in our data set. Coal tends to be relatively abundant. In fact, on our reserve data, coal reserves globally are sufficient to meet current production for more than 130 years. So the question is, so even though demand is rising rapidly, if coal is so abundant, why are prices going up? First, let's look at the distribution of coal production and consumption around the world. I could have saved your eyes the trouble and just put up one chart because it's the same chart. To a much greater degree than is the case for oil or gas, coal reserves and production are co-located with where the consumption is. The world's biggest consumer is also the world's biggest producer, China, with a 40% market share. The second biggest is the same, the U.S. In fact, if you make a list of the top 6 coal producers and the top 6 coal consumers, they jointly account for, each of those accounts for 80% of the world's total, and 5 of the 6 countries are the same. And so there's just not that much coal trade relative to other fuels. About 15% of the world's coal is traded internationally. And that compares with just less than 30% for natural gas, and again, 2/3 for oil. But there are interesting things happening on coal trade. This chart shows the biggest coal producers and the biggest growth in coal production outside of China. And again, China is so big that it distorts the scale. We'll come back to China. I'm focusing on the chart on the right-hand side, which shows growth over the last decade in coal production. 5 of the 6 largest increases in coal production have been for exporting countries. Only India consumes most of the coal that's being produced for its domestic use. Of the other 5, 90% of the incremental coal that's being produced is going to export. And so what we see is, again, demand is robust around the world for coal, and coal supply is responding to that. But remember earlier I said that the price increases that we showed for coal were for internationally traded coal? Where we find coal produced for a domestic market, it tends to be very cheap. It tends to win the competition generally among fuels. But as soon as coal tries to hit an international market, we see it hitting constraints. Constraints in shipping, constraints in port facilities, in rail shipments. And those constraints have caused internationally traded coal prices to rise sharply. So again, what we're seeing is a market where the price signals are at work and markets are adjusting, but bumping into constraints along the way. Now I mentioned China. China, once again, continues to play a dominant role in energy markets. Globally, China accounted for 50% of all of the growth in global energy consumption last year. Because of the predominant role of coal in China's energy mix, if you do the math, China coal by itself accounted for 40% of all of the growth in total global energy consumption last year. Now what we see on this chart is, on the right-hand side, China's role in the world's economy, in power generation, and in coal consumption. And on the left-hand side, we see average growth over the last 5 years for China's economy, coal consumption, and then more generally consumption of total primary energy and of power. Some interesting wrinkles here. Last year, China liberalized coal prices. And in fact, coal consumption, while it's averaged 11% in the last 5 years, last year grew by only 8%. Only 8%. At the same time, the government has been trying to improve the efficiency of coal use, closing inefficient state mines, closing smaller, inefficient power generating plants, and building newer, more efficient ones and focusing on more efficient mining facilities as well. However, coal prices last year were liberalized, but power prices were not. So, if you're a coal-fired utility, coal prices go up in China, you can't pass that price along. One thing you do is you run down inventories. Then this year comes along, winter storms, an earthquake disrupt the ability to move coal around the country, and the lights start to go out. We've seen that since then, the number of these small, less efficient power plants and coal mines have come back into service. So I wouldn't expect to see the efficiency gains that are implied here again this year. Also, last week when the government announced that it was reducing oil subsidies, it announced that it was renewing restrictions on coal prices and also at the same time raising power prices to try to offset the unintended consequences of last year's measures. Now, speaking of power generation, power has actually emerged as an increasingly interesting story in the world's energy mix over the last few years. Again, we don't report this data in the printed statistical review, but we do have the data available on our website. Last year, global power generation grew by 4.8%. That was fully double the rate of underlying energy consumption. You can see that there's, broadly speaking, a pattern over the last 10 years where power generation grows more rapidly than the economy, which in turn grows more rapidly than energy consumption. Last year was unique only in the degree to which that occurred. It was a very strong year for power generation, and where is that acceleration taking place in recent years? Not in the OECD countries, but rather outside the OECD, on the back of not just strong economic growth and not just energy-intensive economic growth, but just the sheer demographic, people moving from the country into the city, growing rates of electrification outside the OECD. Now, as we will see shortly, it was actually a subpar year for nuclear and hydro globally last year. And what it suggests is that actually demand for power generation was the principal driver of global fossil energy consumption last year. Moving on to some other issues. This chart shows carbon emissions. An immediate caveat. This is not official audited greenhouse gas emissions data. All we did was we took our oil, gas, and coal consumption numbers from the review. We used the UN's standard conversion factors for the carbon content of the separate fuels to calculate a first look at what happened for fossil fuel-related CO2 emissions last year. And what the data shows is that emissions grew last year by about 2.8%, faster than the 10-year average, faster than overall energy consumption, which was 2.4%, because of the robust use of coal. On a regional basis, only Europe saw emissions declining last year. It does not appear to have been the case that the primary driver of this was the EU's emissions trading scheme. Again, as I mentioned, the carbon price was effectively zero for much of the year. Seems more likely that the key drivers were a warm winter and the reaction to rising fossil fuel prices. Elsewhere around the world, we see continued growth of emissions. And again, at the end of the day, what the data says to us is that we don't see evidence in the data that the world has really cracked the nut of how to delink carbon emissions from economic growth and from energy consumption growth. Turning next to reserves, this is a topic I know we've discussed in this forum before. We track proved reserves using national data, and going back to 1980, you can see on this chart the message is very clear. The world is not running out of oil. In fact, reserves tend to go up and not down over time. That's to say, through some form of new discoveries or, more typically, finding ways to squeeze more oil out of the deposits we already know about, the world manages to prove more commercial reserves than it produces as a very strong general pattern over the last 27 years on this data. Now, reserves are highly concentrated. Proved reserves, 75% of the proved reserves are in OPEC countries. Last year, proved reserves declined very slightly by 0.1%. Although I have to say that reserves are the most difficult data for us to gather on a timely basis. We have a lot of data that we just have to roll over, and so the more appropriate data set, data point to look at is last year's data, which has now that we have better information been revised up by 31 billion barrels. The biggest sources of revisions were in the Canadian oil sands, as well as guttery reserves. As an additional line item, I would note that we include that portion, as an additional line item, we include that portion of the Canadian oil sands which the Albertan government reports as established reserves less the portion that is under active development, which is about 20 billion barrels. The 20 billion barrels is put under the proved reserves for North America, and the remaining portion is an additional line item of about 150 billion barrels. Globally, reserves are sufficient to meet current production for a little over 41 years. Again, it doesn't mean the world will run out of oil in 41 years because, as you see, reserves have trended up and not down over time, and are constantly being replaced. Gas reserves are sufficient to offset current production for more than 60 years, and as I mentioned earlier, coal for more than 130 years. This leads us to conclude that at a global level, a resource constraint is not the primary challenge that the world faces. That the challenge of having supply grow to meet growing demand is predominantly driven by above ground factors rather than below the ground factors. And that is to say that it's not geology at the global level that is the driving factor behind the challenges that supply has clearly been facing in keeping up with rising demand. Next, I mentioned the subpar years for both nuclear and hydro. The chart on the left shows that globally, nuclear electricity output last year fell by a little over 2%, the biggest decline in our database, which goes back to 1965. 90% of that net decline was in two countries, Japan, with the nuclear outage that we mentioned earlier, and in Germany, where there were a number of plants that were on extended maintenance. More globally, we see that interest in nuclear power continues to rise in the face of rising oil prices. Last year, there were 4 new nuclear power plants that were connected to the grid, and 7 plants broke ground, which is the biggest number of new plants entering construction since we've been tracking that data going back to the year 2000. However, I would point out that with more than 430 nuclear power plants in the world, 7 new plants under construction is not a huge shift. And in fact, I think globally the nuclear industry, nuclear power faces significant challenges just to maintain its market share. Nuclear, like hydro, accounts for 6% of the world's primary energy mix, and those shares have been fairly stable over the last 20 years. But the challenge for nuclear power is that there are a large number of power plants that are nearing the ends of their safe operating lives, plants that were built in the 50s and 60s and will need to be retired in the next few years. In fact, last year there were 7 nuclear power plants that were retired, tend to be old and small. But again, that's a force that will mount in the coming years. For hydroelectric output, we've seen before last year 3 years in a row of very strong growth. With high fossil fuel prices, there's interest in expanding the hydro base. We see growing capacity in India, China, Brazil. Last year, however, that growth was partly offset by drought here in the U.S. that caused a double-digit decline in U.S. hydroelectric output. Turning next to renewable forms of energy. Again, this is data that we don't publish in the printed review, but we do track and post on our website. And what the data shows is that many forms of renewable energy are growing very rapidly, but from a small base. At a global level, they're not large players in the world's energy mix, although they are beginning to have an impact in individual countries. So, for example, globally, wind, solar, and geothermal energy account for maybe 1.5% of the world's electricity generation. And that's even after the fact that wind and solar have been growing by 30% annually every year for the last decade. But in certain countries, like Germany shown here, where we see the role of renewables in power generation, countries like Germany, Denmark, Spain are seeing that renewable forms of energy are achieving double-digit shares of the power generating capacity in those countries. Similarly, for ethanol, globally, ethanol production rose by just under 30% last year to 900,000 barrels per day. Although the ethanol, if you want to account for the energy content differential, you need to take 1/3 of that away, because the energy density of ethanol is that much less than it is for gasoline. On an energy content basis, ethanol accounted for 0.7% of the world's oil consumption. However, even there, you can see that this shows ethanol production in the U.S. and ethanol's share of the gasoline pool, which is approaching 5%. As we've discussed earlier, it is clearly affecting the refining economics for the production of gasoline. So again, renewables are growing rapidly globally, still small contributors, but starting to make a difference at the margins, and especially in certain countries. I should note that where we do see rapid growth in renewable forms of energy, they tend to be in countries that have aggressive systems of government support for those energy sources as well. And so let me wrap up. We started out by saying that energy prices had been very high and rising. I think it's clear that one of the key drivers of that is an unusually strong period of global economic growth. And not just the fact of high economic growth, but where it's happening in the developing world, in particularly energy-intensive countries. That rapid growth is exacerbated by constraints that we see on both the supply and the demand side, most clearly on the oil market side, but also to some degree for other fossil fuel markets as well, gas and coal, where markets are not really deep and liquid globally and are constrained in their development. Now, hopefully, you will agree that we feel that the data shows very clearly that where markets are given the opportunity to work, we see producers and consumers changing their behaviors in response to those signals. And I think, while we won't make predictions, I think, one of the keys for where energy markets go in the future is the answer to the question of, will the process of energy market and economic liberalization that has governed these dynamics for most of the last 3 decades continue, or will we see a resurgence of government control and intervention, which we are seeing at least on some dimensions. With that, I'll thank you for your time, and I think we have some time for questions and discussion. Thank you again.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to wait for a microphone because we're taping the event. We have an archive which you all can come in and visit from our website, www.bakerinstitute.org, or our special energy pages, www.rice.edu/energy. And also, we all sit and pore over these tapes afterwards to do write-ups and say, did Mark really say that? So it's important to have the mic in your hand when you ask a question. So let me open it up to you, the audience, to ask Mark about his presentation. Very interesting presentation. Some surprising things, some things I guess we're all thinking, and now we know they're true.
My name is Bami Shinoy. I asked this question to your colleague in Istanbul, and I'm asking again because I didn't get a satisfactory answer.
Uh-oh.
You talked about refining capacity growing, and you also said that the differential between heavy and light, they are narrowing. And I told that just before last week, Financial Times showed that it is still widening. And now, have you taken a study in terms of just the average refining capacity going up, or is there also upgrading capacity? Has it increased? Because if it has really increased, then the differential should have narrowed quite a bit. Because I did the study till 2007, and you are right, it was narrowing. But the latest Financial Times is showing it is going up again. So can you please comment upon what exactly is going on in refining capacity and whether it is really supporting these prices?
This question is especially tricky because it was not just my colleague who you asked that question of, it was my boss. So whatever he said was obviously the complete truth. The data that we report in the statistical review is crude distillation capacity. And so, the data that we report doesn't track the constraints in upgrading capacity, that is kind of downstream from the crude distillation unit. And that's clearly been a contributing factor to the high refining margins and the wide crude quality differentials that you note. As you note, last year, I think in part because of OPEC's market management, the differentials between at least the OPEC basket and, for example, Saudi blends actually shrunk slightly for the year as a whole. This year, they've widened again. And I guess one of the questions is, well, why has that happened? Obviously, there are still constraints in the system. We tend to think that globally, refining is a highly competitive industry with low barriers to entry, but there are still investment lags. We think that we see investments taking place. We see the data on the CDU front that we showed here. We think we can see that same kind of investment taking place on upgrading capacity. The Indian refinery that I mentioned is, fully upgraded, for example. And apparently some of the Gulf producers are actually sitting on heavy oil waiting for that refinery to open, guessing that they can get a higher price for their relatively low quality crudes once it opens. I guess, well, maybe that's the answer. That's kind of what it takes. And we see evidence that people are actually waiting for it to happen to take advantage of it. So why don't I leave it at that?
Questions?
My name is Dale Dorn. I was curious if BP has tried to differentiate with regard to the 7.7% increase in natural gas production from the United States between conventional development and unconventional development. Anecdotally, most of that seems to be coming from unconventional, but I've never seen a statistic.
We don't actually. That's almost exactly the way it shows up in my script. That we don't track it, but anecdotally, most of it seems to be in unconventional plays.
Let me ask an interim question while we're passing the mic. I have a question for you on two statistics you mentioned. One, both are related to U.S. energy policy. One is your statistic that ethanol is coming into the gasoline pool in 2007. It's about between 4 and 5% of the gasoline pool. That makes it sound like there's an increase, but how does that play relative to what MTBE used to be in the gasoline pool? So the question is there really an increase yet, or are we just still replacing MTBE? And then the second question is, you mentioned that this is the first year U.S. production has risen. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about sort of the trends in U.S. production. How much of that was the deep water plays? And do you think that, were there to be a broadening of opening in the OCS, do you see that trend? Could that be a continuing trend?
On the MTBE question, I don't know. To what degree it's fully replaced. There's different energy densities, and so I think one of the keys is to make sure you get the right correction for the energy density. And more broadly on U.S. production, well, as I noted, I think personally, we all know that production in the deep waters is growing, we just have recently begun to start up a significant field in the deep water. But I think, as an energy economist, what I find to be most interesting is the growth onshore. Because it's, people have been poking holes in the ground in the U.S. for 150 years, and yet at these prices, there's an incentive to go back into these same mature plays and to find ways to increase production further. In fact, working for a European company, if you want to annoy your European colleagues, you can point out that the price of CO2 in Texas is actually higher than the price of CO2 in Europe. Because here it's used for enhanced oil recovery, and at $140 a barrel, there's quite an incentive to do that. As far as policy going forward, and the access questions you raised, we don't know at the end of the day. There are estimates of what the resource endowment is for areas that had been off limits, but until there's development. It's really just an estimate. there may be some of the BP folks may be interested in discussing that more offline if people want to follow up on that when we're finished.
Okay, sorry. Just on nuclear, you mentioned that there was, I guess, a minor, kind of a small decline last year, and there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of new plants that are being proposed, so forth. And you also mentioned that there's the aging plants are being taken offline. Just on a sort of broad level, do you see that the nuclear power, do you think there's going to be a large increase over the next 10 years, or do you think it'll be flat, or what's your sort of forecast for nuclear globally and in the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, if the plant's not under construction now, it's not going to be here in 10 years. And the level of construction that we can see has stepped up, but it's still modest relative to the size of the nuclear industry worldwide. And so I think the prospects for the near term are modest at best, and I think it will depend crucially on the pace of retirements over the next 10 years.
I know this is meant to be more of a review than forward-looking, but when you look at the U.S. gas consumption number last year, it was up 6.5%. As we look forward, what is the BP view of constraints on the natural gas side in the U.S.? If we're not going to build a coal plant, we're not building nuclear plants, it all comes down to natural gas power demand.
Up until last year, gas consumption had in the U.S. been broadly flat for a decade. And you could see very clearly the evidence that gas was getting squeezed out of many sectors of the economy because of the price impact. Where gas consumption has been growing steadily is in power generation. There's still a good chunk of gas-fired generating capacity that was built over the last decade that is relatively underutilized, at least at a national level. And so I think there's room for gas in power generation to continue to grow. What we've seen in the last year is that as gas has been favorably priced to compete relative to the competition, it's done so successfully. It seems to be rising again this year, and again, even netting out the weather impacts. And so, I think there's scope for gas consumption in the U.S. to grow. I think the keys obviously will be the supply and demand balance. Will domestic supply retain its forward momentum? It's a mature play. It's required a very significant increase in investment and drilling activity to register the growth that we've seen so far in production. And how will the U.S. compete for incremental LNG supplies around the world? I mentioned that gas tends to trade at a significant has recently traded at a significant discount to oil. In other parts of the world, gas contracts are linked to the price of oil. And so I think that has the potential to provide additional support to gas prices here just through that LNG arbitrage mechanism. And how those factors net out will determine whether, the degree to which U.S. consumption grows going forward. Oh, the other thing, obviously we have to take into consideration is climate policy, which on the surface of it would seem, at least, especially in the short term, to be beneficial for gas demand relative to coal anyway.
Yeah, hello. On the topic of fuel competition, can you comment some more on the competition between natural gas or rather actually oil as a source of refined products and competition from maybe coal and natural gas to basically, especially in this area of high oil prices, there's more potential. So gas to liquids, coal to liquids, and things of that sort.
What we have seen is that on the surface of it, you would think that a much higher oil price would tend to make the competition look better. However, the cost inflation that we see apply to the oil business applies. These processes for producing gas to liquids and coal to liquids are very technology intensive and capital intensive, and they've seen significant cost inflation as well. And so it's really the differential that matters, it turns out, at the end of the day. And the other question is, as it is more broadly for the oil industry, is how much of that cost inflation is structural versus cyclical, and if cyclical, what's the wavelength of the cycle? We do see more interest in both of these fuels, the gas to liquids and coal to liquids, but it tends to be kind of, stranded gas. And for example, even in there, we've seen a slowdown in plans as costs have escalated. And a lot of the coal to liquids, for example, that we see is places like in China, where at least up until last year, the coal prices were controlled as well. And I think that seems to be what it takes. Some kind of a specific niche where there's a disadvantaged product.
Let me just add to that comment, because I'm sort of compulsive about this topic, that Ken and I, last year, in working on a program with the AAA Auto Club of the United States, worked out if you could take sort of the existing technology for, electric cars, and you were going to price your driving per mile, and you could plug in the United States instead of filling up. And the numbers were actually quite astounding at what was then a 7-cent kilowatt hour average U.S. electricity price, and at that time a $3 a gallon gasoline price. You could drive 2 cents a mile by plugging in, and it would cost you 17 cents a mile at sort of the average car efficiency we saw last year to drive on gasoline. So I don't know if the market will recognize that in terms of infrastructure development. You have GM's announcement they're going to bring back on the electric car. You've got Nissan's experiment with electric cars in Israel. But it is sort of an interesting dynamic to think about a future BP statistical review and whether we'll have any transport sector moving away from liquid fuel and over to gasoline.
We've heard a lot of talk so far about the possibility of gas prices going up drastically in Central Asia between the Caspian Sea and China, possibly from Gazprom giving up some of its basis differential between there and Europe. It's hard to say. Do you have any perspective on what's happening here, when there might be changes, and is this going to bring forth a lot more gas in Central Asia if it does happen?
I like coming here because I always get tough questions. I think one of the things that's become clear is that there is advantage in diversity. So from a producer's perspective, the more different outlets you can have for your gas, the more secure you are as a producer of being able to, it might be cold winter in Europe, or it might be, let me say, warm in Europe, but it might be cold elsewhere. And if you have the diversity of supply, either through a diversity of pipeline or through a diversification between pipeline and LNG, it improves your portfolio performance. I think we clearly see Russia's interest in that, in growing a diverse slate of supply. My sense is that, from a Central Asian perspective, the additional challenges managing the geopolitics. I wouldn't pretend to have a sense on how that dimension of it would play out. But I think again, it's a compelling resource base, and there's certainly an incentive, at today's prices, for that fuel to find a market and to find ways to share the rents to produce win-win scenarios.
Yes, I was interested in your comments of subsidies and sheltering consumers from high product prices. Could you tell me approximately what percent of production is currently subject to subsidies, and what percent of the population of the world basically is subject to these subsidies that shield the prices?
The level of consumption among the two categories of subsidies that we had on that chart, they account for about 25% of the world's oil consumption, and they accounted for 100% of the growth. Since countries like India and China both fall into that category, it's got to be easily half and probably more than half of the world's population live in economies where prices are to some degree subsidized.
How will the commercial aviation industry continue to be affected by the rising cost of jet fuel? And twofold, and correlating that with the middle distillate demand growth as well as the supply. How will the aviation industry rebound? If you see them ever rebounding.
You're probably better off asking that from of an aviation expert. Yeah, I can give you Boeing's chief economist's phone number if you want to follow up. I mean, what I would offer as an energy economist is that it depends crucially on the industry's ability to pass those costs along, and that means that it's a function of supply as well as demand, and how sensitive demand is to these prices and how competitive the industry is. Seems to be a very competitive industry. We've talked a bit about the strength of the middle distillate portion of the barrel, but at the end of the day, it's the price of crude oil. I mean, these are highly competitive markets, and what drives the retail price, at least in competitive markets, of heating oil, diesel fuel, jet fuel, gasoline, at the end of the day, it's the price of crude oil. We want you recorded for posterity.
You mentioned the growing disconnect between U.S. oil and gas prices, with gas prices really falling behind in terms of rate of growth,
Right.
Relative to oil prices. Do you see that delta being, coming together? And if so, when?
Well, I think it's happened already this year to some degree. Gas prices have generally increased relative to crude oil prices. And to residual fuel oil prices. I mean, there's two things at play here. One is that, as we discussed earlier, residual fuel oil is trading at a growing discount to crude oil, and gas has tended to compete against residual fuel oil. So it's not necessarily that gas competes against crude oil, it's the different products. And so first, the difference between crude and resid has widened, so that's created a gap for gas. But then even so, the gap between resid and natural gas has also been wide. I think that that's in the process of correcting. We've seen that gas prices elsewhere around the world have tended to be higher. I'm not sure what you all are hearing. I mean, the last figure I heard was that anecdotally, some Japanese utilities were paying $20 a million BTU for incremental LNG cargoes, or something in that ballpark. I mean, we're today at $13 at Henry Hub. So that's a pretty significant price increase if you can find the flexibility in the tankers and move them across. So I think that there are corrective mechanisms underway. That said, I think there are also good reasons to think that at very high oil prices, gas will trade at some kind of a discount, and that's because gas doesn't just compete with oil; it competes at the end of the day with coal too. And the degree to which coal prices haven't quite matched, especially domestic prices, haven't matched the increase in oil prices, that's an additional drag for gas. The other, again, as I mentioned earlier, the other thing over the longer term that we need to keep our eye crucially on is climate policy. Because at the end of the day, in the short term, where the carbon price matters is it's basically in power generation, the price of gas should more or less equal the price of coal plus the price of carbon.
While we're passing the mic, let me ask you a question, Mark. You showed the numbers from the CFTC, and there was this really, sort of surprising lack of interest in speculating in natural gas and this huge interest in speculating in crude oil in terms of volume. Could you talk about the link to Wall Street's love affair with oil and the dollar and financial trends, and whether you think that is the reason why the speculators are sort of staying out of natural gas, and why the movement is really mostly to crude oil as opposed to, say, heating oil or natural gas?
Mm-hmm. What I would say is that when we look, we've tried to study the linkage between oil and the dollar, and we find no connection. We find, I suppose, at a theory, the theory is that if the price of the dollar goes down, then consumers in appreciating economies will perceive cheaper oil prices and buy more of it, and therefore demand would be higher, and then prices would be higher because of that if there was no offsetting behavior by producers. There's nothing that says the price of oil has to match the price of dollar inversely one for one, even in that theory. And in fact, we've gone back and studied the data, and going back over a quarter century, there's no statistical relationship between the dollar and the price of oil. They have been very closely correlated for most of the last year and a half. And I think what's happening is exactly what you put your finger on. There is a temporary confluence of underlying factors that are reinforcing these developments. Financial market turmoil, weak interest rates, a weakening U.S. economy, a perception that the dollar is weakening as a store of value. Meanwhile, commodities, and in particular energy, have been strong recently, and so there's a sense that this is maybe a good store of value. So there has been a correlation between those two over most of the last year and a half. However, I would note that it's broken down in the last 2-3 months. As soon as you started to hear talk about the Fed maybe raising interest rates, the dollar stabilized, and yet the price of oil has continued to go up. And so, we certainly don't, internally have the view that, fluctuations in the dollar exchange rate, will correlate or drive oil prices going forward. And we view what we've seen recently as kind of a temporary phenomenon.
And what about the cyclical nature? In other words, as the dollar sinks and oil prices go up, the U.S. deficit becomes the trade deficit becomes larger, and that puts more pressure on the U.S. economy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, in fact, there is, if there is a linkage, there's kind of an emerging thought among some macroeconomists that it's that causal relationship and not the other way around. It's not that the dollar drives the price of oil. If there is a relationship, it's that the price of oil moves, and as the price of oil appreciates, there's a sense that the U.S. economy will weaken, the trade balance worsens, and that could be a factor driving the dollar to weaken. And so, this is kind of an emerging field of thought in the macroeconomics field. But if there is a relationship, it may actually be the opposite of what most people talk about.
A quick question for you on the statistics about China and the other countries' gasoline demand and where that might reside. What is BP's view on the per person vehicle saturation rate in China and India? As I understand, there's about a 400 million group of middle-class Chinese now with purchasing power, not unlike middle-class U.S., but I think our saturation is pretty complete for cars and trucks in the U.S.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. The latter point. I mean, the anecdote I hear is that there's more than one car for every licensed driver in the United States. I don't know the answer to that. I think on one level, you can depress yourself by saying, oh, look, there's 2 billion people in India and China, kind of reaching income levels that their demand is going to take off, and if they get to a level where they consume energy per capita like the U.S. does or like Japan does, it can't happen. The numbers are beyond our ability to think about. And I think the point is, we don't know how it's going to play out. It can't be a business as usual trajectory, but then it won't be a business as usual trajectory. And the question is, how will these things play out in ways that we don't expect? Amy kind of hinted at, how things can change in a big way unexpectedly over time, with the right set of incentives. And so I can't make a prediction about where that's going to go. I think it's, however, clear that it can't be, just a development along a status quo trend, to where we are today.
Quick question on your discussion of natural gas, where you talked about how natural gas, LNG imports to the U.S. slowed down a little bit in the last year. So that was related to increase in U.S. production. Do you see that as just a short-term trend or more of a long-term issue?
Last year LNG imports rose strongly in the U.S., and that was despite a very strong increase in domestic supply. It was because demand was growing rapidly and that prices were advantaged relative to spot prices in Europe for much of the year. And so there was an arbitrage across. This year, LNG receipts have collapsed because U.S. prices have been, even though rising, have been weak relative to European prices. I think structurally, LNG shipments around the world will continue to grow rapidly. Where they go from year to year, I think to a large part is dependent on where the contracts are written. 5 out of 6 LNG cargoes go to where they're contractually written to go. and only about 15% are in this kind of arbitrage mode. I suspect that will grow over time because you're going to see more flexibility and diversity among numbers of buyers, numbers of sellers, numbers of ships, which is a critical dimension because it provides the logistical flexibility to move things around. So I would expect that the arbitrage will grow over time. And what that means for the U.S., it depends.
So I'd like to ask you a question about the Russian statistics. The Russian statistics were a little disturbing. If you think about the fact that we're having a sort of political transition in Russia, could be some more political vying among different internal groups for control over resources or profits from oil that tends to have a destabilizing effect in Russia. How big and how important would it be if Russian oil production stayed flat? Could that mean that we're in for even rockier times ahead because they've been a swing supplier?
I think it matters a lot. I'm not sure I would classify Russia as a swing supplier in the sense that they don't ratchet production up and down on purpose to meet fluctuations or to try to manage the market. Although clearly, as I mentioned, Russia by itself has met all of the growth in Chinese and Indian consumption combined this decade, and that's no longer the case. Production now is declining. Now, I'm not a Russia expert, but I think it's revealing that as soon as this data started coming out, showing monthly declines in Russian production, you started to see Russian officials, or at least some Russian officials, saying, maybe we need to pay more attention to this tax regime. My sense is that there were clearly at least parts of the government that were uncomfortable with rapid growth in the early part of this decade, and more concerned about marshaling the resources. But at the same time, I think it's also clear that declining production is not on the wish list either, and that our sense at least is that continued modest growth in production would be kind of the preferred outcome. Now, it depends. That depends on how or if the investment regime evolves and whether it succeeds in attracting the incremental investment needed to sustain that modest growth. Our view. Reserves are a state secret, so nobody really knows, but our view is that it's not the resource base that's the constraint, it's the investment activity. And that the resource base appears likely to be sufficient to support higher levels of production, certainly through the medium term.
A little earlier you spoke about subsidies, and I read in the paper last week that the Chinese government increased the subsidized price to its consumers by about 17 or 20%, and as a result, the price of oil dropped by $3 to $5. Do you see these governments that provide a lot of subsidies to their consumers increasing their subsidy amount or the subsidized price as a way for them to tamp down demand in the future? I know you're not supposed to be forward-looking, but what do you think these governments will do in the future?
I suppose it varies by country. Certainly subsidies are not there to tamp down demand. I think in the particular case of China, the combination of policies has had the impact of, at times over recent years, tamping down demand. What happens is the subsidy regime in place means that refiners are losing money, and the degree to which the government makes transfers to the refiners to keep them whole influences the operating levels of the refineries. So we've seen occasions when, in recent years, refineries tended to reduce their runs because they were losing money. And so you had the perverse effect that when the subsidies were lifted, the refineries increased runs and demand actually went up. That's an unusual circumstance around the world. More typically, we see that these subsidies are immensely popular. Well, who wouldn't want one? I keep working on trying to get BP to give me a discount on my gasoline, but no luck so far. They tend to be very. You see civil unrest when the subsidies are unrolled, and so I think there's trade-offs around the kind of the standing of the government and the civil unrest and the affordability of it, and so it's not just an objective function of trying to minimize or tamp down demand, but how that balances against this range of different political and economic objectives that the governments are juggling. By and large, though, I think the evidence is clear that as oil prices have soared, the subsidy regimes in place in many countries have just become unaffordable.
Per barrel operating costs and drilling costs have been increasing tremendously in the last few years. Do you see any stabilization of that?
It is really interesting to note how well you can predict the industry's cost base by looking at last year's oil price. and so, while it is always true that, the next barrel you're producing is harder than the first, the first one, by definition in economics, you get the easy stuff first and then you work your way up the supply curve. I think over long time periods, the clear tendency in our industry has been that technological innovation and cost cutting has been at least as strong, if not a stronger force than depletion. And so where we are right now is on the upside of that cycle. I think it's, I don't see the evidence that a lot of that is based on a dramatic change in the technical challenge of getting that incremental barrel out of the ground. Canadian oil sands, the geology hasn't changed at all. It's all above ground costs. Then it becomes a question of what is the world durably short of, in producing, new petroleum geologists and engineers or steel, or, what are the dimensions of that cost and inflation and how much of it is cyclical versus structural. My bias is that in time, much of it would turn out to be cyclical.
Mark, going back to the slide on the CFTC and the question about speculation in the market, if I read it correctly, I think your graph only went back a couple of years, and the real increase in open interest seems to have come since 2004, when Goldman started pushing commodities as an asset class. And my question is, I'm just curious if BP or the Baker Institute has any evidence that these large sovereign funds that have developed, particularly those fueled by petrodollars, are participating in the futures market.
Don't have any information on that.
I guess what I would say is it's only anecdotal. I have been working on this topic with Mahmoud Al-Gamal, who holds our chair for Islamic economics. He was just out in Jeddah and other parts of the region. He sent me an email from an investment fund out from the Gulf asking people to join in to long oil funds, right? And so we can't tell you the volume. I think McKinsey's done some interesting work on just sort of the dollar potential floating around in the region. And we don't really have any good statistics right now, but I would say the following thing. There are people who are nervous and in flight either from the dollar or from traditional investments. I'm afraid to be in the stock market, or they're afraid to lock into a banking system, right? Or obviously people were previously being shoved into the real estate market, and that doesn't look so attractive anymore. So the other thing that's happened is that the sort of traditional internal places you could invest your money, which one of the things that was different about this run up in petrodollars is, people invested at home in Dubai and in the local stock markets and so forth, but that has really bubbled out. And everything in the region is highly inflated. So you're starting to see the money sort of pour out. And we've seen some of the money come out in, bailouts of U.S. financial institutions. And I've seen a lot of the money, because we've been trying to track it, pouring into sort of emerging markets opportunities in Africa and also on the subcontinent, right? But it's hard for me to believe that in a region where, people are going to these traditional investment counselors, and as you mentioned, Goldman, but some of the others are pushing long commodity funds, that some of that money isn't being channeled into long commodity funds. But until we start to have more regulation of the market, it's since we have the 2000 rule change, it's really hard to know actually how much money is pouring in and what the source is. I think one of the things the Congress has looked at in the last couple of weeks is whether to open up the dark market so that there could be some understanding of what money's flowing in and whose money is it. Okay, I think we've had a great session. I'd like to thank Mark again for coming and visiting with us this morning. And we have a few refreshments out in the Commons for those of you who would like to ask Mark a private question or a question you didn't think he'd answer. And we also have copies of the BP statistical review available out on the table. So thank you again for coming. We'll see you again soon.